Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Kelsey Cole. The minimum wage debate has gone from the federal to the local level over the last few months, as elected officials, union leaders, business owners, and minimum wage workers all weigh in on the issue. Mayor Eric Garcetti has launched an ambitious campaign to force a $13 an hour minimum wage requirement for all workers in Los Angeles over the next 3 years. The proposal has been criticized by some business leaders who say it will lead to layoffs, cutbacks in workers' hours, and price increases to maintain profits.
Well, it's going to affect our bottom line because with the minimum wage rise, we're forced to pay our employees more. And because we're a small business, we are forced to work with a smaller budget. So with the minimum wage increase, we're going to have to lay off a few of our drivers. Smaller business, smaller budget. Every cent counts.
My business, I run around 33 to 35% labor cost, which means that 35% of my income goes just towards labor. If you raise the minimum wage, and I don't raise prices, that's going to increase my labor costs. So the only way for me to survive as a small independent business would be to raise my prices so I can maintain that 33% labor cost.
Workers in Los Angeles disagree on the effects of the increase.
Well, I'm in school right now, so I do have to have extra money to pay for school. I have to buy food, groceries, laundry.
I think minimum wage should not go up because then the cost of living in California goes up, which means my rent goes up, my food prices go up.
I think it's great. Give opportunity for at least college students that just graduated the opportunity to earn some money.
It may be a bad thing because the prices of everything else will rise, causing inflation, and which will lead to everything being higher, and everything's already so expensive in California, so it may not be too much of a great thing.
Activists from various campaigns such as Fight for 15 and Invisible Workers continue to say Garcetti's plan is only the beginning. Nearly half of college graduates who work are receiving minimum wage, and more than 40% of college graduates continue to work for businesses that pay minimum wage. Now here's On Point's Courtney Wallace with more on the story.
Thank you, Kelsey. So joining me today, I have Rachel Torres, representative and research analyst for Unite Here Local 11. Thank you. I have Dr. Glen Whitman, a professor of economics at Cal State Northridge. And finally, I have Dr. Shirley Svorny, another professor of econ here at CSUN. Thank you all for joining me today. So Rachel, let's start with you.
Sure.
Here I have a graph illustrating the rise of minimum wage from 1996 to 2016. What kind of impact do you think that this increase has had on the Los Angeles economy?
So, I think, $10 an hour is about where we're at. Through 2016, so I think we're at 9 something at this point. It's worthwhile. The raising the minimum wage is a worthy pursuit. But I don't think anyone with a straight face can say that working $9 an hour can support yourself, let alone support a family. It means living paycheck to paycheck and really struggling to pay rent. Los Angeles, as you mentioned, it's a very expensive city to live in, and rent is expensive. Food prices, gas prices, all of those prices have gone up exponentially, and wages have stagnated.
Right. Thank you. So Glenn, my next question is for you. How will Garcetti's recent proposal affect social programs and resources for lower income families?
Well, I think this is actually a point that Dr. Svorny could talk to better, because just for the program we were talking about the fact that as you raise the income of some lower income people, the result of that is actually a reduction in the amount of social benefits and programs that are available to them, such that you can even have a potentially very low marginal or very high marginal tax rate. But would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, it can be very high. In other words, if your salary goes up by a certain amount, if you lose benefits that are equivalent, you could lose money. So the best targeted program is the Earned Income Tax Credit. It targets like the working poor, and just a quick look at that, it looks like an increase in the minimum wage that we're talking about would reduce, means about 13% of it would be offset by just a reduction in the Earned Income Tax Credit. But then there's also temporary aid to families, and there's the food program, the nutritional program, and there's a lot of other health care benefits. So all of those are means tested. In other words, the poorer you are, the more money you get for those programs. And so if you're really trying to help the poor people in the U.S., the better way is to increase the earned income tax credit, not to do this.
Right, right. So Rachel, again to you, will a minimum wage increase make it hard for people, specifically low-skilled workers, to find minimum wage employment?
Not necessarily. So, you know, there are great programs out there, like local hiring and job training programs that target individuals who historically have not had access to those kind of jobs, jobs that have a career ladder, jobs that, you know, are typically labeled as entry level, but do require a lot of work. So our organization, a lot of great organizations in the city are doing just that. We're looking at communities that have been disproportionately blocked from these kind of jobs and making sure that as there are new hirings, for example, at LAX, there's a big expansion there. What we've done is targeted a lot of the local communities in that area and worked with them to make sure that they have a good resume, that they have some training in their background, that and have enough skills that they can go into those jobs, which are a little bit paying better jobs, and have access to them. So I don't think it's necessarily a negative result.
Right. So Shirley, you mentioned if we want to help you know, poor, unskilled, lower class workers and families.
I wouldn't use the word lower class.
Okay, excuse me.
I would use households that are, you know, in the bottom 20% of the distribution of income.
Okay, so for those families,
Yeah.
if we want to help them, we can raise the earned income tax credit. Do you think that, how do you think that that will benefit the that demographic of people more than raising the minimum wage?
When you raise the minimum wage, you reduce eligibility for the earned income tax credit. So some of the increase in the minimum wage is offset by a reduction in the earned income tax credit and then other benefits, social programs. But I think, you know, most of the people who are really poor don't have anyone in the labor market, so you can't help them with the minimum wage. And most of the people who earn the minimum wage are not in low-income households. So you have to ask why the government has chosen this strategy to help the poor. And one answer is that the government doesn't have to pay for it, whereas if they wanted to increase the earned income tax credit, which would directly help the working poor, they would actually have to pay for it. This way it makes them look like they're doing something good. I don't agree that it won't have an effect on employment. I think it will, and the people we're most worried about are the people with the least skills. And right now I think unemployment rates in inner city youths are 30%. It's very high. And putting this, it's going to help the people who get the increase in the wage, but we already know there appears to be a big effect from raising the minimum wage in the airport hotels just in the last 4 years. So I just don't think we can be nonchalant about thinking that this isn't going to affect the least skilled, and they tend not to benefit very much from job training programs.
If I can add on to that, if you had two programs to choose between, and one of them was going to raise people's compensation, but there was also a good chance it was going to reduce the number of jobs available. So some people actually lose a lot of compensation because they either lose jobs or don't get them. The other one is going to raise compensation and is actually likely to boost the amount of employment among the group of people that we're talking about. Which is the obvious program to choose? To me, the obvious choice is the one that has a positive effect on both fronts, both on the amount of compensation and on the amount of employment. And yet, for some reason, we've chosen the other one. We've chosen the one that has these trade-offs involved where we're going to help some people but then harm some other people. I don't think that's a very good choice of policy.
But can I make a point? We know why we're doing it, right? Because the poor people don't vote, the least skilled people don't vote, and the unions are behind this 100%. There's hotels that are unionized and they want to reduce the competition for their hotels by forcing other hotels to be just as expensive. And they're the ones who contribute to political campaigns. So if you think this is about poor people, I don't. I think it's about political contributions to campaigans.
Right. So Rachel, my next question is for you. The U.S. income inequality rate is at the highest that it's been since 1928. This issue is getting a lot of attention. How do you think that it's connected to the minimum wage debate?
Yeah, I think they are square right in line. I mean, I don't think we would be having these kind of discussions if the gap between the rich and poor wasn't as stark as it was. I completely disagree on this position that low-income people and working people do not vote, that this is a so-called union tactic. I would strongly argue that low-income people have the most to lose in all of these situations. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're struggling between two jobs. They have limited access to health care. When they're sick, they may not have a day off of work, so because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. So this is a life and death matter. This is not political maneuverings. This is working people who have struggled for 30-odd years in wages stagnating, and recognize that raising the minimum wage is not a cure-all by any stretch of the imagination. I completely agree that I think we need to think broadly and comprehensively about how to raise all boats, but I do think it's a start. I do think that when folks have a couple more dollars in their pocket, that's the difference between paying their rent on time and not paying their rent. That's the difference between having a couple of dollars to spend on groceries. That's the difference of buying books if you're a student. These are matters that are quality of life, and people fight for this because they're fighting for themselves and their communities, for dignity and respect. And I applaud the mayor and mayors across the country who are taking leadership on this to move this forward. I think that folks are very excited, and this could be, this is the heart and soul, I think, of who we call ourselves as Americans, frankly. And I think that, the mayor said that this is an American moment, and I think we should be very proud of the work that he's doing, and cities across the country that are saying, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and it's time to do something. It's not the end all, but it gets us in the door.
Okay, thank you for that. So Shirley, in explaining the history of the creation of minimum wage, it was said to be for the protection of labor abuse. Can you offer us further explanation for the Fair Labor Standards Act?
For the Fair Labor Standards Act?
Yes, for the purposes of why.
Do you want to talk to that?
Sure. I mean, you're talking about the initial federal legislation which created the first national minimum wage.
Yes.
And I mean, certainly it came out of at least partially a motivation for wanting to help very poor people. And I think that that's been true of the motivation for raising the minimum wage all along. However, I don't think that you can look just at that surface level. There's an economist named Bruce Yandel who talked about the theory of bootleggers and Baptists, and it's the idea that for any legislation, you're likely to have two groups that support it. You have your true believers, your so-called Baptists, and those are the ones who really are pursuing it out of an idea that this is the right thing to do. And then you have a different group of people who are the more cynical supporters of it, who are supporting it simply because they are going to benefit from it in some way, but they benefit from cooperating with the Baptists because the Baptists give them the cover of a seemingly moral justification. And I think that that's what we've seen in the past with the Fair Labor Standards Act when it was passed. Back then, the unions were a large part of the support behind the passage of that law. And what it did was to raise the wages of people that they were competing with, because you had unionized labor versus ununionized labor. The ununionized labor, which was often minorities, often immigrants who were not unionized and who were willing to work for a lower wage. By forcing those people to have a higher wage makes it more likely that more of the business is going to end up going to the unionized sector. And so they end up harming some of their competition in order to help themselves, but they dress it up as a benefit to the poor. And I think that's exactly what we have happening right now in the present. If you want the best evidence of that, my understanding is that the current law, the one that just got passed, actually has an exception for unionized businesses, using unionized hotels. So in other words, the minimum wage jumps up to $15 or $15.37 an hour for the non-unionized hotels, but there's an exception for unionized hotels. They don't have their minimum wage going up. Instead, whatever is their current bargaining agreement continues, even if it has wages substantially below that. So you can see that this is really just a tactic for the unions to be able to put the screws to their competition.
Right. So Rachel, as a research analyst at Unite 11 Local. Can you share some stories of some people that you have encountered along your journey? Stories of people who have impacted and inspired your involvement?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's really why I do this work. You know, the majority of people that we work with are women of color, immigrants who traveled to this country seeking a better life and found themselves even more exploited. So they have been, you know, they work off the clock. They work, you know, when they're sick. Many folks have been, you know, harassed, intimidated, fired when they stood up and said, you know, today I want to take a day off and have asked for that day and have been said, no, you can't take that day off. You know, they had an issue with their child, so they had to take that day off. They were literally fired the next day, or their schedule was changed so much so that they worked on days when there was no business. So this is, you know, I work in the hospitality industry, and, you know, this is an industry wrought with exploitation because of that, because of who the workers are. And so, you know, it's been an honor and a privilege to work with them. They are leaders in this movement. They are the ones who are saying, you know, we are citizens, we pay taxes, we deserve respect. And unfortunately, employers have been behind the time. Not all employers. I mean, that's the truth of it. Many corporations already pay a decent wage because they recognize that paying people a good salary and treating folks with respect actually prolongs and cuts costs. When you have a rapid turnover of workers, folks, you know, that takes a lot more money to hire and train and so forth. If you have folks who, you know, have a good job, who get paid a decent amount, no one's getting rich here, but a decent amount, folks tend to stay longer. And that's really been the difference at many of the hotels that we've seen, where when workers have organized and have pushed to have a little bit more dignity on the job, you know, they stay at their job longer. And the relationship between employer-employee is completely different.
So let's suppose that you yourself are a minimum wage employee. You know, working 40 hours a week with the average cost of just a one-bedroom apartment. It's about $1,500 a month.
Yeah.
And then adding variables such as, you know, having a spouse, which could, you know, add to your monthly income. However, variables such as having children can make that, you know, relative. It's all relative.
Yeah.
So can we really say that these people are making a living? Are they living? You know, are they making a living to live?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I think that the majority of folks probably would say no, that they are barely making ends meet. A lot of folks work 2 jobs. And, you know, in the hospitality sector, folks tend to have to live on opposite sides of the city and commute into the areas where people, you know, go to hotels. And so that means driving long hours. You know, we have a big problem of traffic in LA. So you could spend, you know, 2 hours on your commute every day. That cuts time with your family. That's like a health issue. That's, you know, a problem of global warming. So all of these things work together. We can't sort of take one thing outside of the other, but I would totally agree with you that I think we have to sort of ask that question, like what is living, and more than that, what is the good life, and how we residents of LA and, you know, people of conscience, how can we create that?
Right. Thank you. So Glen, as we kind of briefly mentioned, there has already been an increase within the last 4 years in base pay for about 12 hotels near LAX, which has led to a loss of hospitality jobs. From this, what can we conclude will happen with the new increase in wages for hotels in Los Angeles?
Well, I think it's important to realize that, of course, that's not just an isolated incident. There is a panoply of economic evidence indicating that the conventional wisdom in the economics profession is true, which is that when you raise the price of something, people tend to buy less of it. So if you raise wages, fewer people tend to be employed. And sometimes that happens with people getting fired or laid off. More often the way it happens is simply the payroll doesn't expand. You don't have more hires in the future. And particularly when it comes to the establishment of new businesses or expansion of old businesses, some of those decisions get made on the basis of expectations about those wages. So once again, you see that this is a policy that, while it helps some, and we I would not question at all that some people are clearly helped by getting higher wages, but those are the ones who are lucky enough to be able to keep their jobs after the higher wage goes into effect. Then there are other people, and these are the ones who are not seen, who just don't get these jobs as a result. And those people don't experience that increase in wages at all. Furthermore, what I would say is that it's simply not the case that when you raise people's wages, that everything else stays constant in their lives, but instead it may be that there are other elements of the compensation package, such as whether they get various fringe benefits, whether they get free meals at fast food restaurants, for instance, that end up getting cut as the employers start to compensate. So that if you raise this part of the compensation package, they may compensate by cutting another part of the compensation package. So as you have a larger number of people competing for these jobs because of the fact that they're competing for this higher wage, but a smaller number of them actually getting hired, that puts the employer in a position of effectively being able to pick and choose and discriminate amongst them. So who do you think that they're most likely to choose? The person who is able reliably to always be there at the same time every day and to come at the last minute and so forth because they don't have any obligations to spouse, children, they don't have a long commute or whatever? Or is it going to be the people who have fewer of those other obligations and as a result are able to be more reliable for that reason? I expect it's going to be the latter. So the result is once again, you see that the people who may be getting hurt the most by this are the people who most need the help.
Thanks. So Rachel, just to piggyback off of that, can you offer us a different perspective of how the increase is to at least $15.37 an hour? I know that you're very active on your social media in the Raise LA campaign.
Yeah.
So how significant do you think that this is going to be for hotel workers? Can you offer us a different insight?
Yeah, I mean, we're hugely excited about it. We've implemented similar policies in Santa Monica and Long Beach, and the results have been really positive. Now, the City Council in Santa Monica already puts a $15.37 as the wage scale for all future hotel development, and hotel development there is booming. And as a result of that, a lot of the other hotels, because they want to have a competitive workforce, are paying that wage irrespective of a citywide policy. So we see that, instead of what a lot of corporations do, which is a race to the bottom, we're seeing a race to the top, which is that workers are working together, and employers are paying their workers a decent wage. And so I think we see LA as this booming economy. This is a industry with $1 billion in revenue, and the results. The industry predicts that the occupancy rates, the revenue, the level of development. I mean, every week we read about a new hotel project being developed in the city. This is an industry that's thriving, but that has this really high low-wage worker sector. It's an industry that can afford it, and it's an industry that has a lot of low-income people whose lives could, greatly change for the better because of it.
Okay, so Shirley and Glen, can you elaborate on some? Do you guys think that this the raise in the minimum wage for hotels, could it affect cities outside of Los Angeles? Could it benefit other Southern California cities more than it would Los Angeles?
You mean as a result of just LA having raised its minimum wage and they're keeping their?
Yes.
I mean, my immediate reaction, and I don't know how big the effect would be to say some business will stay away from Los Angeles and go to those other areas instead. So for instance, if you're trying to decide whether to have your convention in Los Angeles or to have it in San Diego or to have it outside of California entirely, hopefully you're going to go to the place where they're going to offer you a better rate. But the place that can offer you a better rate is a place that is not having to pay wages that are artificially propped up by government. I would expect that one of the effects of this, although again I would say I don't know how big the effect is, but I would say one of the effects we could expect over the longer run is you're going to see fewer hotels either being built or being expanded in Los Angeles, and instead more business going elsewhere.
Right.
Can I make a point to that?
Absolutely.
The mayor knows that because the mayor's been saying, Mayor Garcetti's been saying that he would like the neighboring cities to have the same wage we have. And the only reason he would say that is if he's afraid of losing business. So he's being pretty disingenuous by saying this won't have an effect, but we really need everyone else to come along with us. He knows that our borders, there's lots of cities on every border, and it's just as easy to build on the other side of the line.
Right. And can you further elaborate on what this could do to the sales tax revenue of Los Angeles?
Right, it could reduce the sales tax. Well, there's actually an occupancy tax that comes from the hotels, and so that could be affected. But certainly the city lost a lot of money by not letting Walmart go into South Central. It was just, you know, they just built Walmart somewhere else, and now there are some Walmarts in the city, but the city had a rule about how big they could be, and we lost whatever sales tax revenue would have been generated, and the opportunity for the whole community, South Central, to have a revitalization around the new Walmart facility. All of that didn't happen.
I also think it's really important to make clear what the comparison point is. Look, if you're comparing the present to the past or the future to the present, right? So you're talking about changes over time. It might be because of factors which have absolutely nothing to do with the minimum wage that there's going to be growth in the hotel sector. That's something that's going to be true irrespective of what happens with the minimum wage. And so you might very well see an increase in the minimum wage at the same time that you see expansion. But that would not be a refutation of what economists say. What economists generally say is that you have a reduction in employment relative to what it otherwise would have been. So in other words, we could see the hotel industry continuing to grow, but not growing as fast as it otherwise would have because of these artificially high wages.
So Shirley, as of the first of the year, Seattle increased its minimum wage to the highest in the country at $15 an hour. We can definitely use this as sort of a research project. Can we look at this as an example to see what the consequences will be in Los Angeles?
Well, you know, this is what economists have done for 60 years. They've looked every single time the minimum wage changes, and one of the most reputable is Newmark, right? He's
Greg Newmark, yeah.
Yeah, and he, you know, he's written stuff that most economists agree with. To give you just an anecdote, when LA put in the living wage, I remember that the city council person, her chief of staff, who was really excited about it, said, "And we're already attracting a better quality of worker." It just tells you everything. The poorest people aren't going to get those jobs when you push up the wages. And like the mayor has suggested, by thinking that everyone else needs the wage, the jobs are going to go outside the city.
Rachel, Glenn, Shirley, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching On Point. If you would like to see more, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at CSUN On Point. You can see us on Channel LA 36 every Saturday and Sunday morning, and you can hear the show on CSUN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. For everyone here at On Point, I'm Kelsey Cole.